What would you say is the likelihood that the country will be out of the recession by the end of this year, or what would be your view of when the recession that we're currently in is likely to end?
You know, we could go back to tennis if you'd like, David. There are two kinds of economic forecasters, those who know they don't know, and those who don't know that they don't know. I think if you look, you have to see a couple things. You have to see that there are still substantial downdrafts in our economy, that economies don't go from losing 600,000 jobs a month to a terribly happy path overnight. You have to see that there are still substantial strains in credit markets. But you also have to see that there has been a substantial anecdotal flow in the last 6 to 8 weeks of things that felt a little bit better, that there's been some easing in credit conditions, and that it's now quite clear that production is declining, is running significantly below final sales, which means that inventories are running down, which sets the stage for some movement in the inventory cycle. So I think the sense of a ball falling off a table, which is what the economy has felt like since the middle of last fall, I think that is going to. I think we can be reasonably confident that that's going to end within the next few months, and that you'll no longer have that sense of free fall. How strong, how rapid the turn will be, that's a less clear question. If you look at consensus forecasts, they would tend to suggest that you probably were going to be out, there was at least going to be periods where you were out of negative territory by the end of the year. If you look at questions of sustainability, you may get some inventory cycle, but that doesn't mean that you've reestablished strong, sustained growth forever. I think that's difficult to judge. But what I think we can be fairly confident of is that the combination of the measures that have been put in place and the natural dynamics of inventories and purchases of goods means that this sense of free fall that we've been living with will be arrested within the next few months, and that will provide a platform and a foundation for the ultimate expansion that will come. How strong will that expansion be? That's going to depend on what happens in the global economy. That's going to depend on the imponderables of consumer psychology and market valuations, and it's going to depend on, and here I'm quite optimistic, on our success in carrying through with the President's program that will inject substantial demand into the economy, that will provide a basis for restoring increased confidence in the financial system, and will address the needs of the housing market.
Do you believe that the unemployment rate is likely to go much higher than it is today before we get into expansion?
I think there are 2 points you have to recognize with respect to the unemployment rate, David. Unemployment lags a little bit what happens to real economic activity, and that in order to keep the unemployment rate constant, GDP has to grow at a rate that, economists argue all the time about this, but that's somewhere in the range of 2.5%. So even if we got a return to positive growth, an economy that was growing at 1% would be an economy with rising unemployment. So I don't think we can hold out the prospect that unemployment will stabilize at the current level. And I think there are 7 cameras there, which means there are 7 too many for me to provide a number for the number at which it will, at which it might be likely to peak.
Okay. The expansion that we're likely to get eventually, let's say next year, how would you think this expansion is likely to be different than other expansions out of recessions?
You know, I think we have to look back, and I think this is one of the more painful aspects of thinking about the economic history of the country over the last generation. We had a period of relatively healthy expansion in the middle part of this decade. We had a period of sustained economic expansion in the late 1990s. Both of those, in retrospect, we now see were substantially supported by financial bubbles and the associated wealth creation. In the case of housing and credit spreads in this decade, in the case particularly of high-tech stocks, but to some extent the broader stock market in the 1990s. Those were associated with a very substantial financialization of the economy. In some years, corporate profits reached 40% of total corporate, financial sector profits reached 40% of total corporate sector profits. And I think it's probably also fair to say that those developments, the bubbles and the financialization, were not unrelated to the fact that the benefits of the expansion were very narrowly concentrated and not widely shared in a small group within the population. And so I think that it has to be the objective of our policy to have a much more sustainable kind of expansion that we bring about. And that really goes to 3 crucial areas for the president. The set of issues around financial regulation, and particularly the control of the kind of leverage that made an accident like the one we've just seen possible. It goes to the global economic strategy. You know, when I was here in Washington last time, I used to say all the time that the global economy can't indefinitely fly on a single American engine. Well, it actually did fly much longer than I would have thought possible until 2007. But now it's clear that that can't be the growth paradigm going forward. So there are important issues around the global growth strategy and domestic demand. And then there are crucial areas around where's the demand going to come from in an economy where we're probably have some large overhangs in areas like housing, where the savings rate is likely to tick up. And that's why the president's emphasis on healthcare, the president's emphasis on infrastructure, the president's emphasis in particular on restructuring the energy economy aren't luxuries to be deferred at a time when we have a weak economy. They are actually an integral part of a strategy for having a different kind and more sustained kind of economic expansion. And I think that really needs to be our objective, so that these next years are not just a period of recovery, but a period of renewal as well.
As we recover, do you worry about inflation? The worry about deflation presumably has gone away, but are you worried about inflation coming back, and something we haven't seen for quite some time, but is that a concern of yours now?
I think it's a very complicated path that we have to walk, because frankly I think there are risks of both deflation and inflation. If you look at previous periods in our economic history when the rate of when the level of economic slack, the output gap, the unemployment, whatever, was as large cumulatively as it's likely to be during this recession, you saw periods when the inflation rate fell by 4 or 5 percentage points. A fall of 4 or 5 percentage points is a very different thing starting at 8 than it is starting where we started here. Now, there are all kinds of things that are different about the inflation process when it gets down near zero. But I don't think the concern about deflation in the nearer term is one that can be entirely discounted. And I think it's one of the reasons to make sure we don't get into a deflationary cycle, why the president thought it was so important to have a very large program of fiscal stimulus at the beginning of the administration, why there have been such an ambitious set of efforts to support credit markets. Now, I do think that you really do have the challenge, and it's really a huge challenge for us as a country. I mean, you can think about it, think about the model for a company where the strategy for the company is it is really important that for the next 2-3 years, the company needs to really step on the gas and expand its activities. But after that, it's going to be really crucial to restrain expenditures. That's a difficult strategy to implement, but that's really the kind of challenge we're going to face as a country. And that's why, while the president's budget is very much oriented to, and policy has been very much oriented to stimulus and investment in the short run, they're very much oriented to containing the budget deficit over the medium term. And there are similar challenges on the financial side. Right now, if you look at market indicators, they would like the gap between the yield on indexed bonds and the yield on nominal bonds. They would suggest relatively low inflation very low inflation expectations by historical standards. But I don't think that's a basis for any kind of complacency. Okay. And I think this is something we're just going to have to constantly watch. And the thing about an inflation is, at the moment it's absolutely clear you have the problem, is a moment when you may have been too late in addressing it. So I think it's a very difficult balance that policy is going to have to walk. But honestly, I felt honored to have been asked by the president to help at this moment. I think the economic challenges that we face are very, very large. I think the challenges in managing the economy at a moment like this go to broader issues for us as a society, and so I feel honored to have the opportunity. Feel honored to have the opportunity.
You more or less have now invented something called the daily briefing for the president on the economy. For 50 years or so, presidents got daily briefings in the morning on the national security situation. You have now taken on the responsibility of briefing the president daily on the economic situation. How did you come about with that idea, and how would you think the economic policy making process is different now than when you were in the government before?
The idea was the president's, and the president asked us the day before the inauguration that beginning the day after, or the day after, the day after the inauguration, he wanted to receive an economic briefing each day and to have a meeting with the members of his economic team. And so the members of his White House economic team plus the Secretary of the Treasury meet with him each day, and typically talk about whatever major developments there were that day. Christina Romer often talks about how to interpret whatever statistic is being announced, and Tim Geithner talks about what happens has happened in financial markets. And then we very frequently have a particular topic to discuss. What's happened in in housing markets, what's happening in some aspect of the global economy. And then there are usually some ongoing policy issues, whether it's how are our deliberations proceeding with respect to policy towards the automobile industry, for example, and we cover those. And the president very frequently has questions. So it, I think, reflects the gravity of the economic situation that the president inherited. And it also reflects his very strong desire to be critically involved in not just the broad principles, but also the underlying policy choices that are being made in some crucial areas.
Now, the president just returned from the G20 summit, among other places and overseas. What would you say would be his view of what he accomplished at the economic summit with respect to our G20 colleagues, other members of the G20?
You know, I feel very good, and I know the president does, about the outcome of the G20. I think you can make a strong case that if you take the G20 process over the year that we're now partway through, from the time the president was elected through to this G20, through to what's going to take place in when the G20 is reconvened in the United States last fall, I think you can make a very strong case that it's been the most productive period of economic symmetry in the last generation. I think there are really three crucial areas where progress has been made. First, the dynamic of competition to be dealing with serious problems has led to and contributed to a much more serious increase in regulatory energy in the United States and around the world. And I don't think you've seen as much desire for and push for reform of financial regulation anytime since the Second World War. And I think the need to report on it, the process of it being dealt with collectively, the range, the global character of the issue, given that many of the largest financial institutions really are operate in many jurisdictions, has made the international dimension a crucial one. So I think it has pushed forward that dimension. Second, what was brought forth out of the London meeting was probably the most important increase in the international financial system's capacity to protect and assure stability of the flows to emerging markets since the founding of the IMF and the World Bank. The $1 trillion that was committed between the IMF and the Asian Development Bank really represents well over a doubling of the capacity of those institutions to lend and to protect the stability in the flow of finances. And third, the commitment to the idea that the priority has to shift to growth, to a global growth strategy, to the level of fiscal commitments that we've seen, and to everybody participating in a process in which the IMF is going to be monitoring and evaluating what countries are doing and reporting back. It's never realistic that in a world of democracies with legislatures that you're going to get precise, concrete commitments that are negotiated with foreigners rather than with countries' own legislatures. But I don't think there's any question that the process has been an accelerant for measures that push economic expansion. So I would say on the sort of technocratic economic side, the meeting's outcomes were quite successful, and I think that the president was also able to project a rather different tone and image for the United States, at least in terms of the way many abroad saw it, than had been the case in recent years.
In terms of regulation, the administration has talked about proposing a systemic risk regulator. Do you have a view of whether that should be a new agency or should be done within the Federal Reserve? And what do you think the resolution of that, when do you think the resolution of that will be?
This is something that is very important, and as you know, David, Secretary Geithner testified on this last week or 10 days ago, and I expect will be testifying again. And I don't think we can say right now precisely what form this will take. I think it's pretty widely expected that the Federal Reserve would, as it does today, certainly have a very major role in any approach to systemic regulation. After all, it's the Fed that has responsibility today for bank holding companies. But just what form will ultimately emerge from the legislative process, I think it's probably too early to predict.
And the president's proposed a major national health care program. Do you think, in the light of the economy, that it's really realistic that it be implemented or passed this year and become law this year, or do you think it's possible that it might be deferred a bit?
Look, I think every year that we do not have some kind of comprehensive health care reform is a year in which we have missed a chance to do something substantial to address the most rapidly growing component of labor costs, and therefore that we've missed a really important opportunity to do something somewhere between the incomes of American families and the competitiveness of American businesses. You know, economists debate in the short run, in the medium run, in the long run, if you contain healthcare costs, does it show up as lower costs for employers, or does it show up as higher wages for employees? And that's an interesting academic argument. It seems to me the larger truth is that if we're able to start fixing the healthcare system, you're going to get some combination of more competitive businesses and middle-income families with higher incomes, and both those things seem to me to be very desirable. So I think the more serious you think our economic problems are, the greater is the extent to which we need to address the efficacy of the healthcare system. Now, some people would hear this, David, and they go, well, how could that be right? What it's mostly about, or what it's substantially about, is paying for the cost of people who are uninsured, and maybe this is a moment when we can't afford that. Well, I guess I would make 2 points. The first is that, to a very substantial extent, the uninsured do get treated. They just get treated late, poorly, and ironically, more expensively because of the delay, and that we all end up paying for that care in our premiums. And so addressing the problem of the uninsured is ultimately a key component of reducing total health care costs. And the second point that I think doesn't get emphasized enough in talking about it is that if you pressure the system downwards on costs and you don't do anything about the uninsured, you get an untenable outcome, because the way people cut costs is not by becoming more efficient, but by becoming better at squeezing out high risks and reducing the amount of uncompensated care they do. And so addressing the needs of the uninsured, which is one component of the types of approaches the president has talked about is really an absolutely necessary condition for taking the steps that are necessary directed at efficiency that are really crucial if we're going to simultaneously compete and provide for the kind of income growth for middle-income families that's essential to drive the economy forward.
Okay, so what about cap and trade? Do you think that's possible to be done this year as well, or is that something that might or might not get done this year as part of the president's environmental program?
You know, it's hard enough to dodge questions of predicting what's going to happen in the
economy. You're doing a good
without
job
without having to also dodge questions about what's going to happen politically. But I will say this about cap and trade. It's interesting. Ben Bernanke and I went to graduate school at just about the same time. I was a graduate student at Harvard, and he was a graduate student at MIT. And I'm making what was an enormously analytically sophisticated piece of work seem much simpler. But the essential idea, or an essential idea, in an important part of his PhD thesis was about the inhibiting effect of uncertainty on investment. The idea that if you know that energy prices are low, you'll buy one kind of boiler. If you know that energy prices are going to be high, you'll buy another kind of boiler. If you don't know whether energy prices are high or low, and it's going to be revealed to you a year from now, you will buy no boiler and get the lowest level of investment. And I think that's an insight that is very pregnant for thinking about our energy debate right now. If this is a moment when we want to stimulate all kinds of investment, reaching a conclusion as a country about what we're going to do about energy independence, reaching a conclusion as a country about what we're going to do about global climate change, rather than having it hanging out there with the sense that something's going to happen at some point but nobody knows what, is, it seems to me, very much the best thing to do for generating the investments that are necessary to move our economy forward. Now, obviously, cap and trade is a very complex thing, and there are a lot of features that go into discussion of it, and certainly it's sort of my role as a person at the NEC to be part of the process, making sure that the economic equities are represented in terms of the needs of families, in terms of the needs of businesses to compete. But I really do feel that it's important for effective recovery that we come to the conclusions we're going to come to as a country, which I think many, many people, and certainly almost every scientist who looks at this, would say go through a higher price of carbon and go through something like a cap and trade system. I think it's very important to come to those conclusions sooner rather than later.
Larry, your mother was an economist and your father was an economist, and they were distinguished professors at the University of Pennsylvania. Your mother's brother won the Nobel Prize for Economics. Your father's brother won the Nobel Prize for Economics. Did you ever consider not going into economics? It might be difficult to hold up the family tradition. What led you to go into economics as opposed to physics or something else?
I thought for a while about going into mathematics or physics, and then two things happened during my MIT career. One was I saw what some of the real hotshot mathematicians and physicists at MIT were like, and I decided that perhaps another direction might be optimal. It was sort of an experience a little bit like the moment when you're about 11, when you sort of play Little League baseball and realize you're probably not going to be playing for the Philadelphia Phillies or Boston Red Sox. I had some of that experience with some of the people who studied math and physics. And I think the other thing I realized was that insofar as I did have some capacity to do things that were analytical, I really was interested in using them in ways that engaged with public policy and engaged with trying in a sort of direct way to make the world a better place. And sort of having come to those two views, economics seemed very natural. I have two brothers. One is a lawyer and one is a doctor. And so someone once said to my mother, really, it's pretty good. You've got a doctor, a lawyer, and someone who's gone into the family business.
And your career is hardly over, but of the things you've done, being Secretary of Treasury, President of Harvard, the current position, your writings, your teachings, and so forth, what would you say is the achievement you're most proud of having put together and done so far at this point in your life?
Oh, I don't know. I sort of try to look forward on these things, not backwards. I think I'm proud to have played a role in the economic success that the country had in the 1990s. Part of the reason I went into economics and part of the reason why I went into macroeconomics was that I realized that managing all this stuff, budgets, banks, flows of capital, interest rates, better or worse, really did touch the lives of millions of people in very important ways. And I think in the 1990s, we were fortunate in being able to manage those policies in relatively successful ways. And I really think it affected the lives of a very large number of people in ways that made those lives better. I'm proud to have been able to play some small role in that. And I think the challenges we face now, frankly, are much greater than the challenges we faced then. In some ways, then the financial crises were in other countries. Right. Now the financial crisis is here. And, as I've said a few times, my kids, when they studied U.S. history, learned a lot about the 1930s and what happened in the economy then. And they learned almost nothing about what happened in the economy over the last 4 or 5 decades. The fluctuations, the 1982 recession, that stuff just wasn't something that made it into a history course. And in many ways, I think our challenge now is to make sure and do everything we can to contain what we've inherited. And so this will be a serious economic downturn, but that it will not, when people look back a generation from now, have been an important historic event. And that's really what we're trying to do.
We have time for some questions from the audience. I have some cards here, and I'll read from some of them, and people can hand up some additional ones. One of them is, when does the administration expect to have a tax reform package that will send to Congress, and do you expect any tax reform legislation this year?
I'm sure there'll be tax legislation this year. The administration has a variety, as you know, of tax proposals in its budget. I wouldn't expect comprehensive tax reform legislation in the context of what I think is already a very aggressive agenda for this year. I do think there's a variety of kinds of strains in the tax code, pointed up by the annual treatment of the alternative minimum tax, for example, that suggests that the tax code will have to get visited at some point, and probably preferably sooner rather than later.
Okay, and what about the deficit? The deficit is fairly large now, and the total indebtedness is about, I guess, $12 trillion. Do you have any worries that we might not be able to sell our debt overseas at affordable interest rates? And what is the administration doing about that?
I think it's important to, on the one hand, be very concerned, and on the other hand, also to recognize that if you look, the data are actually quite striking, that on days when markets are suggesting increased uncertainty, increased doubt about the global health of the economy, on days when the investment community is saying that risk aversion has gone up, those are days almost always when Treasury bond prices rise. And so it's important to remember how fortunate we are as a country to have a currency and a bond market that is seen in every way as a source of strength. And it's a huge responsibility for us to keep it that way. And that goes to the need for fiscal responsibility over the medium run. I have no doubt at all that the greatest risk to the Treasury market, to the health of our financial system, would be if somehow we were to fail to contain this economic downturn. And that's why, and if there was to be a sense that the economy was not going to recover. And so the first priority for financial stability has to be policies directed at strengthening the economy and pushing it forward. Once those policies are, with those policies in place, as the recovery becomes better established, does deficit reduction become absolutely crucial? Yes. That's why the president's budget, if you look at what insiders call non-defense discretionary, basically the ordinary business of federal spending, calls for its slowest real growth in the last 30 or 40 years. That's why healthcare reform is so important, because a large fraction of the federal budget is healthcare, and if healthcare spending is growing 3 or 4% a year faster than the rest of the economy, then there is no way that the federal budget can be under control. And if you try to control federal health spending without controlling overall health spending, you know what's going to happen. The people in the federal programs aren't going to be able to, the healthcare system isn't going to want to serve the people in the federal programs. That's why the healthcare agenda is really crucial to the long-term financial sustainability agenda. But yes, it's absolutely important.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, and so let me just take some questions from the audience that haven't been handed up. Any questions anybody wants to raise their hand on? David?
Larry, just a couple of questions about the legacy asset program. So a couple of points have been made. One is that particularly with new mark-to-market rules, it would be even more difficult to have the firms sell these legacy assets. And second, from some bankers who think there's been too much made of this emphasis on toxic assets, and that the program is perhaps misdirected in its prioritization of those assets.
We'll have to see how things unfold, David. I think the judgment at the Treasury and at the FDIC is that while there'll certainly be certainly the overwhelming preponderance of assets that are on banks' balance sheets will remain on banks' balance sheets, that there are a variety of critical situations in which a program of this kind can do something important by enabling a selective de-risking for particular institutions of particular classes of assets, and that once that's accomplished, it will be much easier for them to access the private markets and to be in a position to lend on a robust basis. So I do think that this will be a program that can be used opportunistically in a number of different types of situations by institutions, and will, I think, be one of the pieces that will contribute to an improvement in credit conditions, which is obviously part of what's crucial for establishing robust recovery.
Other question? Sorry, back. I can't hear you. Is there a mic? I can't hear you. Not really.
Given hindsight, your efforts at the Clinton administration and basically deregulation of the banks, if you think that may have been a mistake with hindsight.
Question is, do you have any second thoughts about the deregulation efforts in the Clinton administration?
Remember that comment? Remember that question you asked me a few minutes ago, David, about do I ever have any second thoughts, and are there any moments when I have second thoughts of being in Washington? Look, I think the world has changed in very profound ways since the 1990s. Credit default swaps were a blip in the financial system at the end of the 1990s. The scale of derivative transactions has increased, probably not quite by an order of magnitude, but close, since the end of the 1990s. And I think it's fair to say that very, very few people predicted or fully foresaw some of the structural weaknesses that were laid bare by the events of the last couple of years. Keynes was once asked when somebody said, gee, what you're saying now seems different from what you were saying some time ago. Keynes said to him, when new information arrives, I change my mind. And you? And so I don't think anybody approaching the financial system today can approach it as we did as it was approached in the 1990s. And so I think we need to look at the issue. We need to look at the issue from the perspective of the system we're operating with now, and it wouldn't surprise me if in some areas that may take us to places that were different than we went in the 1990s. At the same time, I think it is a great danger in these things and it's something to which we're all prone, to try to reduce everything to a sort of single continuum. Are you for more regulation? Are you for less regulation? Anything that's in one era, anything that's for less regulation is good. In a different era, anything that's for more regulation is good. I really think you have to look at the issues issue by issue by issue. You have to think about how the different parts interact, and that's how you get to the best possible policies. And that's why we've been studying, for example, the experience of a range of other countries, some of which, I think of Canada, for example, that have probably been more successful at insulating their economy from the winds of financial fortune than we've been in the United States. I think we do need to take fresh looks in this area.
Larry, I know you're working pretty much around the clock, and I assume you're not getting a chance to play very much tennis, but country thanks you very much for your efforts, and I thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank